All right, are you guys seeing that? Okay, great. So thank you very much for having me today. I am Adrienne Marino. I work as the Water Quality Program Manager with the Nature Conservancy here in Illinois. And in that role, I work on our freshwater science and agriculture teams. I focus mainly on edge of field and conservation drainage practices or tile treatment practices. But today I'm going to be sharing a broad overview of the nutrient loss reduction strategy, some updates from the most recent biennial report, and then I'll end with some of the key challenges that are hindering our progress on that strategy. Okay. So the nutrient loss reduction strategy was established in response to hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. And it was established in 2015, but that story goes back a little bit further, at least 20 years and probably more. But in 1997, the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force was first formed at the federal level to help coordinate efforts on reducing the size of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So the dead zone is something that occurs when there's very low levels of oxygen. And very low levels of oxygen are caused by when you have high inputs of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. Those cause algal blooms. When the algal blooms die and decompose, they start to use up all of the oxygen in the water. So that's what causes those low oxygen levels and makes a very large area of the Gulf of Mexico uninhabitable for a lot of aquatic organisms. So some significant events that have occurred in the past 20 years include the release of the Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan, which was in 2008. This was informed by a lot of science that happened in a few years prior to that. But this report called on states to complete and implement comprehensive nitrogen and phosphorus reduction strategies. It first set that 45% nitrogen and phosphorus reduction goal that we still see in our nutrient loss reduction strategy today, along with a goal of reducing the size of the hypoxic zone. A few years later, in 2011, we have the Stoner memo. This is a memo from US EPA Administrator Nancy Stoner. She, in this memo, directed 12 states to develop these nutrient loss reduction strategies aimed at reducing nitrogen and phosphorus levels in the Gulf of Mexico. And Illinois complied with this memo and established its nutrient loss reduction strategy in 2015. All right, so currently, the nutrient loss reduction strategy is administered by the Illinois Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Environmental Protection, or the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, and the University of Illinois Extension. There's a number of groups that are involved and have been involved in both the development and the implementation of that strategy over the past, several years, including from agriculture. We have our ag commodity groups like the Corn Growers and the Soybean Association. We also have several environment and conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy and other groups like that. So the nutrient loss reduction strategy, it really addresses nutrient loads from agriculture, but also from point sources such as our wastewater treatment facilities and from urban stormwater. And so these goals are a long-term goal of nitrogen and phosphorus loss reduction by 45%, and also an interim milestone, which is set for 2025. And those goals are to reduce the total phosphorus load by 25% and the nitrate nitrogen load by 15%. We're going to focus today on agriculture primarily. So as the nutrient loss strategy was being developed, it included a very comprehensive science assessment, and that created a very strong foundation for the strategy. So some key aspects of that science assessment are first, like a quantification of sources of nutrients to the Mississippi River and on to the Gulf of Mexico. So we can see from these pie charts what the sources of nutrients are here in Illinois. If we look at nitrate nitrogen, About 80% of the nitrate nitrogen that's leaving Illinois via the Mississippi River is coming from agricultural sources, just 18% from point sources. If we look at total phosphorus, it's a bit more of an even split, 48% each from point sources and from agricultural sources. So another thing that's included in the science assessment is an analysis of current and historic monitoring data, which is necessary to calculate the total nutrient reductions that are needed to reach the goals that relative to the baseline that was set by US EPA. And that baseline period that we're using is 1980 to 1996. And then finally, the nutrient loss reduction strategy included a prioritization of watersheds for nutrient reduction efforts based on nutrient loading, but also on if there was local water quality concerns in these watersheds, and if there was capacity or active watershed planning available to help augment nutrient loss reduction efforts. The strategy recommended a suite of conservation practices, both in-field practices and edge-of-field practices. It looked at the benefits of these practices for nutrient reduction and also their implementation costs. And some practices such as saturated buffers and WASCOBs have been added to this list since the strategy started as more data on them became available. And then another aspect of the nutrient loss reduction strategy, including the science assessment, was the development of these different implementation scenarios. So a scenario is just a combination of conservation practices that illustrates the types of interventions that are needed to meet the interim and the long-term nutrient loss reduction targets. So these scenarios are not prescriptive. They just show different examples or different pathways to meeting the goals. And they show an example suite of practices and how much you might need of them on the landscape to reach your goals. So here I'm showing two example scenarios that were developed in 2019. The first is for the interim target, and the one on the right is for the final target. Any practices shown in yellow indicate that that practice is used on corn acres primarily, and any practice shown in blue is practices that are used on tile drained acres. Green is representing all corn and soybean acres, and all of the calculations for the percentages of farmland are based on this benchmark value from 2011 of corn and soybean acres, which is 22.1 million acres. So you'll note just looking at these two figures that for the interim goal, we need a lot of conservation tillage and soil test phosphorus, a lot of adoption of those two practices, 90 to 100%. And to meet these final targets, we need even more practices adopted by a majority of farms or used on the majority of farm acres. And this is a very, very high bar to reach, but that is what our scenarios are telling us. And we can talk more about that maybe in the discussion period. I'm going to move on now to the progress related to these goals. So progress is on the nutrient loss reduction strategy. It's reported every 2 years via a biennial report. And we just had a report come out. It was from December of 2023. So according to this report, we are seeing nutrient loads that are above our baseline period. So our baseline here is shown. That is the point by which we're trying to reduce below. So when we say 15% reduction, we're trying to go 15% below this baseline value, and 25% below that for phosphorus. Right now, it looks like our monitoring is showing that we are 4.8% above the nitrate, above the baseline, and 35% above the baseline for total phosphorus. And we are also very quickly approaching 2025, which is that interim target deadline. And it looks like increasingly that we're unlikely to meet those interim targets. It's also notable here that water yield has increased by 23%. This indicates we have more flow in many of the state's major rivers, driven likely by increases in precipitation. We also have here nitrate and phosphorus loads shown over time compared to the baseline, which is in brown, and the 25% and 45% reduction shown as horizontal lines across the graph. So these graphs both show that our nitrate and phosphorus loads have been elevated above the baseline pretty consistently since we started the nutrient loss reduction strategy, indicating that we still have a long way to go to reach these goals. Okay, so if we take a closer look now at how we're doing on individual practice implementation. So on this graph, each practice that is shown is a part of those interim and final scenario examples that I showed a bit earlier. And then the acres that are currently implemented are in brown. The acres that we are hoping to implement to meet the 2025 interim target are in green, and the acres needed to meet the final target are in blue. So for nutrient management, those are looking not too bad. We're seeing pretty good progress on these practices. For example, the use of maximum return to nitrogen, we're seeing that adopted well above the interim target value. And we're seeing pretty good adoption of using soil test phosphorus to inform fertilizer application rates, and also good use of N inhibitors for fall application and some increases in the fall to spring nutrient application. If we look at something like cover crops, currently we're at 1.4 million acres implemented of cover crops, looking to get to 6.9 million acres to meet the 2025 target. So we're at just 20% adoption of the level that we need by 2025, and just 6% of the value to meet that final goal. So this indicates that there's a gap here. We need significant, probably financial and technical assistance to provide more of that hands-on support to farmers as they make these management changes. And then finally, for edge of field practices, these numbers are pretty discouraging for someone that works primarily on edge of field, but we've really just seen a fraction of the adoption of these practices that's needed. And if we also look holistically across the landscape, we're also seeing more tile drainage being implemented. So it's really important that we can try and pair those new tile systems with edge of field practices and tile treatment practices to help mitigate some of that nitrate loss. Okay, so the main takeaways so far here are that Illinois is not on track to meet these interim 2025 goals for the nutrient loss reduction strategy. Our monitoring data shows that our nutrient loads are above the baseline values, and this is despite significant investment and effort by the part of many organizations and agencies involved with the strategy. The nutrient losses that are attributed to the non-point sector, including ag, are increasing. And levels of conservation practice adoption, while they've increased for some practices, it's not at the pace or the scale needed to meet these targets. It's not clear if there's any consequences if the 2025 interim target is not met. Many other states that put together their nutrient reduction strategies did not include any kind of interim targets, but it might lead to a change in the approach for NLRS. It's just something that remains to be seen as we get closer to that target deadline. So I'm just going to cover a few challenges that we're facing related to the nutrient loss reduction strategy. I only have time to touch on them briefly, but perhaps these are things that we can talk about during the question and answer and the discussion. But first and foremost, I think limited practice adoption is one challenge. And we could probably spend days focusing on all of the barriers to conservation practice adoption. I'm sure we've all are dealing with this one. I think critical here is reaching middle and late adopters with messages that resonate with them. We've often heard that the process of participating in a number of conservation programs is too complex, too complicated, and too demanding of time and resources. So that's an area for us to work on. And also, conservation is often falls lower on that list of priorities for all of the things that, farmers are responsible for. Sometimes the conservation practices are lower on that list. So thinking just how do we get a majority of farmers in Illinois and farm managers, advisors, landowners, et cetera, to all start evaluating the need for nutrient loss reduction opportunities within their operations. That's a big question and a big challenge, and I think something that definitely keeps me awake at night, and maybe some of you too. So some additional challenges here are the lag time or the scale that we're working at. So we are working on a problem that has developed over a very long period of time, decades. Many of our interventions that we're applying are field scale. They're fairly diffuse across the landscape. We're going to see a lag or a time gap between when our BMP is implemented and when we can see the benefits in that target water body. So we are monitoring our nutrient loss reduction. The monitoring data is coming from the mouths of these very large river systems. So it's possible that we're just not able to detect a water quality response and that we won't be for quite some time. On a related note, I do think that when we're continually reporting about this lack of progress, that we should be cognizant about how that affects or stalls our efforts. So I think it could be really worthwhile if we had some projects that were at a much smaller scale, where we were demonstrating successful approaches in very small watersheds, in drainage districts, among small groups of farmers, where we might be more likely to see results on the landscape over a shorter period of time and could help drive some more implementation or show that we can be successful with our approach given the right scale. Just two others here. First being climate. We know that Illinois has been getting wetter over the past 100 years. We've got increases in precipitation, 10 to 20% across most of Illinois. Also increases in the number of larger rain events measured as 2-inch rain days. That's increased by 40% during that same time period. And so this overall increase in precipitation is likely to continue due to climate change. And this is relevant because of the role that water plays in carrying nutrients to our surface waters. So we're likely to see greater surface runoff and likely also greater tile drainage runoff as a result of climate change. Another really important aspect here is that many of the projections that have been made related to the nutrient loss reduction strategy, such as those scenarios, such as how much conservation we might need, those were all evaluated using that climate data from the baseline period. And so it's possible that we need to reevaluate those scenarios using a climate lens. And finally, you just want to touch on legacy nutrients. Those are nutrients that have built up in soil over time. And the impacts of this potential nutrient source, especially for phosphorus on loading, is not fully evaluated in the strategy. But it's likely that legacy phosphorus could be released to waterways through soil erosion. And another source that's currently being studied is eroding stream banks. So just understanding more about how legacy nutrients impact nitrogen and phosphorus loads, those can help us be more strategic in deploying practices that are more effective for managing them. All right, my final slide here. a very short ISAP spiel, but ISAP was formed in response to the nutrient loss reduction strategy. So ag and conservation minded groups working in this space could coordinate their efforts and achieve more together. And so one way we do that is by connecting audience to a lot of different practical resources, programs, and technical assistance. So some examples of ISAP's resources are here, and I think that they were going to share some more of those on a wrap-up slide. So I'm going to end here, and I can take any questions, or we can go into a discussion.
Great, thanks, Adrian. Yeah, we've got quite a few questions here actually that we'd like to start you off. Some, I think, maybe some softballs, some tough ones. So
Okay.
let's see. So I think just maybe touching on the work that you do. You mentioned kind of being disappointed in the progress of edge of field implementation. So could you just speak to that? I mean, what are the barriers there that you're finding? Does it change by practice? What are you seeing there?
I think one of the main problems or main challenges on edge of field practices is making a financial case for those practices, because it often does require taking some land out of production. And so I think that's the main challenge. There's other challenges related to the process with NRCS. It can be a time-consuming process or a lengthy process. There's a lot of requirements. There's a lot of engineering. So I think the main ones are land out of production, and then just the capacity within the state to help landowners and farmers through the process of getting those practices implemented.
So maybe how do we fix some of that? Is it like some kind of a performance-based incentive? Would that be effective? I mean, are there programs that have been tried and been successful other places for improving adoption?
I think challenges with edge of field practices are pretty widespread across the landscape. I'm not aware of any that have been super successful. In Iowa, they're doing this program called the Batch and Build, which has seen some success. It's where kind of one organization takes on all of the planning, implementation, payment, everything, and kind of just acts like a quarterback in getting those practices through the pipeline, and batches them into, groups, so that one contractor might put in 10 saturated buffers in one area as opposed to more of a piecemeal approach. That's had some success. We're looking at how feasible that might be in Illinois. Yeah, I think through ISAP, many of our partners are all very engaged on this issue and are trying to work through some of these challenges, piloting out some projects and approaches just to see what happens. And hopefully then we can try and scale those up a little bit more.
Is there anything that we can do better as far as messaging, maybe, or how do we target landowners? Should we be targeting certain farmers? Is there any way we can narrow down who we're talking to and how we're talking to them?
I'm sure there are. I'm sure different messages resonate with different audiences, of course. And so it's always a challenge to figure out which audience is going to respond to which message. But so I think putting more effort into our communications and our marketing and our outreach, so that we are reaching, the landowners that we think might be more likely to respond. I think, thinking through that process is really important. It's not just kind of an afterthought, or like, oh, we have to do outreach and kind of
Sure.
have it very diffuse. So
Does
more
anybody here have a
targeted, I
handle
think.
on? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Does anybody here have a handle on? Is there a hierarchy of difficulty with NRCS for some of these different practices? Like, are some fairly simple to get through, and some are much more difficult? Like, is there a way we could make an informational resource that outlines that maybe a little bit differently, and shows which ones are like a low hanging fruit, or which ones are maybe, a multi-month kind of endeavor?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I would say the the practices that require the engineering, so the structural ones like wetlands, saturated buffers, bioreactors, they might take a little bit longer. Just because the engineering capacity in the state of Illinois is not super high. Like there's not a lot of people within NRCS that have the privileges to design these projects or approve these projects.
But
So
things
yes,
like
looking at
buffers or filter strips and that, prairie strips, to me, seem
yeah,
like a pretty low.
totally.
So I'm wondering if there's just anything like that, like rather than putting these all together, at least making it more clear of like what the time and or money commitment might be for a given practice and
Yep.
giving people
And I think
options.
yes, and even just being more upfront about the timeline at the beginning of a project is also important so that a landowner goes into it with the right level of expectation.
Mhm.
Okay. One question that Helen actually brought up before that she'd been hearing, and I know it's kind of been, I'm sure, making the rounds, certainly in TNC and other organizations, is, and Helen, you may have to jump in if I butcher this, but basically, Helen got a farmer question saying that, Illinois nutrient loss reduction strategy was kind of bleak, but more of the overview of the Gulf was released kind of at the same time, saying that we were basically mission accomplished. So how are we messaging that? What are the takeaways? What are your thoughts on those two different messages?
I'm not an expert on either. I'll just preface with that, but I think that from what I've read, they just use different analysis methods to present sort of the numbers. And so when you look at the data, we're looking at these rolling 5-year averages. And I'm not sure exactly what the process was used to look at the Gulf numbers, but I think that it was a different process. And so just taking a step back to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples, I think is important. And also, like, the goals of the nutrient loss reduction strategy are to reduce nutrients to improve the Gulf of Mexico, but a secondary goal of the nutrient loss reduction strategy is to reduce nutrients to improve local water quality. And so that still matters here for the people that live here in Illinois. Our water quality we have some challenges. And so it might look like, we're making progress downstream, and that's great. We should look at how those numbers were calculated. But we also know that we have some challenges here at home that do matter for a lot of people, and we should still, I think, stay the course in trying to improve local water systems.
Sure, good answer. Because that's one thing that I try to do is drive those conversations to local watersheds and water quality issues, because those are still very much a real thing that people need to deal with and understand. Kind of in line with that, Gene had just asked about, in the nutrient loss reduction strategy, they highlight priority watersheds. How are those targeted areas, how is that being used to inform some of our efforts? Are we targeting those areas specifically, or are we not? What could be done there?
That's a great question, and I honestly am not sure about that. I do know that, like, in those priority watersheds, we do have watershed specialists that are supported and who work specifically on nutrient loss reduction strategy efforts. So that's one way. But there's likely more opportunities to, drive resources to those areas. I do think several of those have had emphasis on watershed planning and maybe some RCPPs and things like that. But there could be more opportunities there.
Can I add just to that? I think I don't know if anybody from NRCS is on the call or anybody from the Soil and Water District, but I think there's a real opportunity. It seems like there's an opportunity to prioritize NRCS funding for those areas above and beyond just MRBI or RCPP funding, and just even in their overall ranking criteria. I don't know if that's a potential to do there? Because it feels like there's been a lot of outreach and education, but it's not necessarily translating to action on the ground. And so some of that is just bringing more financial resources maybe to bear, in addition to that outreach. So I don't know if anybody on the call has thoughts about that or has experience with that. And nobody wants to speak on behalf of NRCS anyway, so.
No, I would agree with all those points that there does need to be a little bit, well, a lot more, right? I mean, we've identified where the problems are, and it feels like I can't name a whole lot of efforts that are really prioritizing those areas. So that's kind of where I've tried to work on. One of the projects that I do work on is the Lake Decatur watershed, getting involved with that RCPP. For those of you that aren't familiar, they got $10 million for infield practices over 5 years. So yeah, more well-defined all-in efforts in those regions, I think is going to be more important for sure. We had a question here, and again, I feel like we're throwing a lot of questions at you, Adrian, that we don't expect you to know, but just any insights on. You're never going to agree to come back to this. So we had a question about, so there's a lot of focus on Illinois' nutrient loss reduction strategy. Any idea how other states are performing? Are we all kind of doing the same, or are some standing out? Do you have any idea?
The only one that I've really followed sort of is the Iowa strategy. Because Illinois and Iowa, they're very close together. We have a lot of the same issues. The strategies are quite similar. They just passed their 10-year anniversary for their strategy. And I think that they're experiencing similar challenges. So they've, seen some increases in implementation and some good things happen, but really are not showing a lot of progress on the data and on the numbers for nutrient and phosphorus level, nitrogen and phosphorus levels. So I think it's similar there. Other states, I don't know that other states really have as robust of a process, both for developing their strategy and also reporting on it as Iowa and Illinois. So I can't really speak to what their outcomes have been so far.
Sure, thank you. Okay, we have a question on how nutrient loss reduction strategy, how those practices are captured in the report. Do you know, are you familiar with how we're capturing, say, the cover crop number, where that source is coming from, the nutrient loss reduction strategy? Is that capturing, private cost share as well, or just what's reported to FSA?
I believe it's what's reported to FSA. And also they've looked at the Optus numbers. I know that that's what's used for tillage. I actually don't know what the actual data source is for cover crops, but I do know that it is laid out in the report, probably in the agriculture chapter. And there's likely graphs and charts and everything you could ever want to know about those numbers. And if anyone else from the nutrient loss team is on the call, they could probably answer that question better than me.
Let's see.
Okay. Isn't part of it also the annual reporting that the partners all do? I think that includes a place to report acres and dollars investment, like the soil and water districts have to report how they've used the Partners for Conservation funding.
Yep, they do collect data from all of the partners. I'm just not sure in their official acreage counts what they pull into that number.
Yeah, and that would be something that's a good idea I've been meaning to look that kind of stuff up, because some of the numbers seem right on track, and some of the numbers of practice adoption that they're reporting sometimes seem a little either high or low. So that, getting more insight on how they're measuring those and how we can improve is certainly a good thing. I may need to have Talon, I may need you to have to just jump in here. You've posted a few pictures, and it looks like.
Yeah, I just,
so
questions. Midwest Regional Climate Center, the Climate tool they have on there is what I use for this. But yeah, the first one just the last 2 years plus, 10 days. departed from mean, and then the second image was the last year. But my overall question is, I knew there'd been drought in the Western Plains for quite a while. That has to be contributing to flow. Is that what we're seeing really with the lower than average hypoxic zone size the last couple of years? I mean, is that the messaging we need to be using, or just explaining the whole process if we can verify that as what's happening?
Yeah, I think the flow definitely plays a role. Like the size of the hypoxic area is driven by the load of nutrients delivered, which is directly correlated with the flow of water and the precipitation. So that, yes, that is important messaging. I don't know that what the dates are for the most recent Gulf hypoxia reporting. I do know that this nutrient loss reduction strategy, this data is from 2021 and 2022, I believe. So it doesn't include 2023. So that's just another thing to look at. But yes, flow is an important driver of the area of the hypoxic area.
And does anybody on here know of a good, like ultimately the flow at the mouth, right, is going to be the culmination of all the flow from all the basin. So do we have at least that number that we can be showing year over year?
Probably. I would guess that that's like available from USGS or from the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force.
Yeah, these are just rhetorical questions, not necessarily right at you,
like, I
Adrian,
don't
but
know.
yeah, but yeah, just discussion more so.
Yep, that's a good idea.
Great, thanks, guys. If there's any more questions, we can take those now. Otherwise, I will hand it over to Helen to talk about the rest of the things we have to share with you guys today.
I guess I had just kind of one more question that I just wanted to pose to the group and see what thoughts were on it. I hear like we're not meeting the goals because of increased flow, et cetera, et cetera. But I feel like part of the goals are really just to see those increased practice adoptions. So to say we're not meeting the goals because the flow is increasing, I think is just kind of for better or worse, it's like deflecting the real issues that we're not meeting the goals because we're not seeing enough practice adoption on the landscape. So I guess I'm just kind of curious how other groups are wrestling with that, or if I'm just making a mountain out of the molehill here.
I will say Lowell just messaged saying that he has a lot to say. And so I've invited him to come off chat and share his thoughts.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. Well, I just read that, I don't know if it was a US EPA report or Illinois EPA report, but that we had met our interim standard goal. Is that what you were referring to, Frank?
Yeah, that was the report that I was referencing. And
Who
yeah, as I
put that
understood
out? Who released that? Because I couldn't find it this morning.
I think I've got that in an email chain. I can look that up real quick here and see if I can put it in chat.
Okay, great. So that's on a water basis. So what I have found is that river flow and nitrate load is quite linear. And so if river flow is up 23% and nitrate load is only up 5%, that is a victory. That is a win. Yes, it's above the 1980 to 1996 baseline, but that was a drier period. I lived through those droughts of 83 and 88. And so, our baseline isn't perfect either. But if we are only losing 5% compared to that river flow being up, I mean, that clearly shows something good is happening. Now, it's not the amount of conservation on the ground. I believe it is these drought-tolerant hybrids and timely rains, and these really high yields have given us better field nitrogen balances, and that's how I would explain why we didn't lose 23% more nitrogen load. So if you put it on a water basis, that's how they came up with this idea that we've already met the interim standard. Now, I wouldn't have said that in 2023. I would have waited to see how wet 2024 was before I made that claim. But now let's talk about phosphorus. Wet years are terrible for soil erosion. So phosphorus load and river flow is not linear. It's more curvilinear. So the more extreme events you have, the more phosphorus you lose. So if water's up 23%, it's no surprise phosphorus is up 35%. No surprise to me whatsoever. So I'm not depressed whatsoever. I don't think that, I mean, it's a challenge for phosphorus, clearly, because these extreme flow events and soil erosion events are just terrible for both dissolved and particulate P. So that's my sort of good news story. I question how many acres we can put wetlands on in Illinois. I think it's a topographic limitation. The Wisconsin glaciation has flattened and scoured, a good portion of Illinois, and that's where our rich mollisols are and very productive soils. But I don't see hardly any places where wetlands will fit into an extremely flat topography. You have to have topography to move water through the wetland or the bioreactor. And if you create a berm at the end of or dig a hole in the ground and call that a wetland, that's just going to fill up, and then the tile's going to back up, and then the tile won't work. So I have a problem with end of pipe techniques anyway when it comes to wet years. What I find is in a wet year, end of pipe strategies are always going to fail. They're always going to let you down. You will not reach the predicted removal rates in wet years, and that's when we need the best treatment out there. So, and then philosophically, I don't think it's the best strategy to send nitrate back to the atmosphere when we could potentially keep it out of the tile in the first place. So I think the best strategy is to work in the field, and so I like cover crops the best. I have lots of data to show how tile nitrate can be reduced with a good cover crop. And one more point, I read papers where, there's going to be more phosphorus in a tile because of freeze-thaw action on the degrading cover crop. I've seen none of that in 8 years in the past 8 years. I can't point to any event that looks like a cover crop put more phosphorus in a tile. And then I read a recent paper by Giovanni here at the U of I, and he's saying, cover crops and fertilizer application is going to lead to more nitrous oxide loss. So my way around that is I'm not really promoting cover crops in front of corn. It's more difficult to do without having a yield hit. So I'm advocating a overwintering cover crop every other year ahead of soybean. If you can grow enough biomass ahead of soybean, that will greatly reduce tile nitrate loss, and it even ties up nitrate after the soybean crop, which we have a leak in our system there as well. And so to avoid this potential interaction of fertilizer and degrading cover crops, if we just did it every other year, we could go a long ways towards reaching our goal. I think we could easily get to a 25% reduction just with a cover crop every other year. So how much do we need? I think 1.5 tons per acre of above ground biomass will do that for us. That's quite a bit of biomass, and in some years the spring's too cold and we can't achieve that. And even with the farmers I work with that are extremely conscious of knowing how much biomass they need, if the soil is fit to plant, it's pretty hard to let the cover crop grow as much as we would need. So clearly that's always going to be a trade-off. But I think the end of pipe strategies are going to be overwhelmed in wet years, and that's when we need them the most, where in a wet year a cover crop has already done its good work. It's put the nitrogen into the biomass and it won't move. So there's my 2 cents. But I would like to ask Adrian, how many acres in Illinois does she think we can put constructed wetlands on?
I hate to break in here. I'm getting messages that Helen has a lot of things to cover for the end of this meeting.
Okay.
I think this is a really good, starting point. I think you've given us a lot of good messaging on some of these topics and ways to reframe and see them in a different way. And I certainly think there's a good opportunity for us to follow up on this on an ISAP call, because clearly there's a need for something. Different messaging maybe from ISAP on some of this. So just to note that Jean did find one article that links to that announcement, so you can all see that did come from the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force. So I think it's linked in there. But I think in the interest of time, I will kick it off to Helen, and you can close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Frank, and thanks, Cole, for bringing it back to cover crops at the ICCON call here. Love that. Yeah, so we wanted to just share that ISAP has developed a 2-pager on the NLRS strategy as kind of what farmers and farm advisors need to know. For those of you who have browsed the strategy, it's like 250 pages, so it's a lot to condense down. But Adrian led that work through ISAP. So yeah, we hope that the 2-pager is going to be helpful for people as they're trying to communicate this with their farmer audiences. And a lot of the charts that Adrian shared in her presentation are also included in the document. And then we also just wanted to pitch that the Illinois Extension is hosting an NLRS conference in a couple of weeks. It's January 25th. There's an in-person option in Springfield, as well as a virtual option that people can tune into. So yeah, they're planning to present on the results and yeah, hopefully some good discussion around what happens next. And then a couple other things. One of these is related. So the if people are familiar with the One Good Idea group, they have a mini grant application that's open right now, and they just extended the deadline to January 22nd. It is, let's see, I think I'm gonna lose that link, putting it in here. $8,000 for a farmer who's interested in putting in a low-cost edge of field practice. And part of the grant is that they need to film a video or record a podcast talking about their experience and what they learned, and that'll go on the One Good Idea platform. We know that video production and podcast production is not everyone's favorite thing or strong suit necessarily. So if you are working with a farmer who might be interested and is looking for funding for these practices, ISAP is interested in partnering and providing some of that support. So yeah, we'd be happy to connect, and you can feel free to send us an email. Yeah, and we'll open it up for other updates from the network. If there's events or resources to share, feel free to put this in the link, put links in the chat. And I'll also share that AFT recently published a carbon market guidebook, top 10 things you wanted to know about agricultural carbon markets, but we're afraid to ask, I think is the full title. So I'll put that in the chat too. And yeah, ISAP's done a lot of work on sharing information about carbon markets, so happy to include this kind of in the mix. yeah, I think that's it from our end. Does anyone else on the call have?
Yeah, I'm going to
updates?
share
Yeah,
a link in the chat here. It's not necessarily cover related, but it's something we just launched yesterday. So we have a new online training module for identifying agriculturally important insects in corn and soybeans. I thought it was kind of cool. It utilized some 3D models, the Beckman Institute, to do scans of insects, and so you can rotate and that kind of stuff. So it's free. It's funded by Growmark for a grant. So check it out if you guys are interested.
awesome. Thanks, Alan. Yeah, if people have other things, feel free to put this in the chat. Rachel, if you want to go back one slide, we can just kind of share dates for the next upcoming calls. Usually we have our speakers ready to announce, but we're planning a series on soil tests and sort of comparing and contrasting different soil tests and how you can use those results when you're making management decisions. So stay tuned for that and some speaker updates in the months to come. And then, yeah, there's some other events coming up that I can, I think Rachel dropped in the events link to the ICCON website, and there's a few that are kind of on our radar. Yeah, and then I also think I took some good notes during this call of like resource needs or things that ISAP could create to help better communicate some of this information. And I think that that's really the role that ISAP is trying to play, is like, what are these common questions and, concerns that people are having, and how can we better communicate that? So if there are like, oh, it'd be super helpful to have, XYZ, a 2-pager on this, or let's find this information and share that more publicly. If there's ideas for those kinds of resources that would be helpful, yeah, we're happy to hear those and try to work towards producing some of those so that we can, help spread the message about, the challenges ahead.